particular subspecies of computational psychiatry, Bayesian and predictive processing approaches to the brain and cognition. So, what's the predictive processing framework? Well, a nice way of understanding the predictive processing framework is in contrast to the kind of standard bottom-up account. So, on the standard view, stuff in the outside world impacts our sensory surfaces and gets processed, gets passed on up. Here, this is from Mar's account of vision. You get an increasing degree of complexity. So most of the action is going in that direction. Now, what's wrong with the standard framework? Well, you could argue that it's slow and inefficient. You would expect human cognition to have evolved to be rather more proactive, preemptive, right? And also you would expect it to be more efficient, because on the standard bottom-up view, the signal accrues complexity as it goes along the processing chain, right? And that can be problematic. So what the predictive processing framework does is it says, well, the action's not predominantly that way, it's that away, right? So when the world impacts on our sensory surfaces, it's already greeted by a colossal barrage of predictions, right? Now, that's not to say that the world is not doing anything, right? What the world is doing is it is updating our predictions, but it's making this little fine-tuning contribution to our cognition, to our conscious experience, rather than on the standard view where our conscious experience is literally constructed out of the stuff that is coming out of the world. So some of you are already potentially seeing how this can give us lots of mileage in thinking about things like dreaming or hallucinations, right? Because the contribution of the outside world is much less great. So in cases where the outside world is not there, it's much easier to make that jump. So let me explain a little bit more about predictive processing. So the way I like to explain it is by reflecting on two things: ambiguity and efficiency. So what the brain has to do is resolve ambiguity, and how it has to do it is as efficiently as possible. So the world is a noisy place, and incoming signals are ambiguous, and that means they're compatible with more than one hypothesis about what is causing them. So why would you pick one hypothesis over another? By stipulation, fit alone isn't going to help you. Like we've said, it's an ambiguous situation. So you need something else to tip the balance, and that is prior probability. The probability of the hypothesis before the evidence, independently of the evidence. So some of you will have noticed that this looks like Bayesian inference. It doesn't look like Bayesian inference, it is Bayesian inference. So just to use an example, imagine you are upstairs in your house and you hear a downstairs window squeak. Suppose for simplicity that there are two hypotheses that present themselves: burglar or wind. Now, both the burglar and the wind hypothesis have an adequate fit, right? Namely, if they were true, they would generate that noise, the squeak of the window. But suppose that you live in an area that has really low crime rate and you know that it's a windy night, then the prior probability of the wind hypothesis is much higher, right? And that's the hypothesis that you should select. Notice that that's a probability completely independently of having heard the window squeak, right? Even if the window hadn't squeaked, right, the probability of the wind hypothesis would have been greater. Okay, so this is an example of a person dealing with evidence in a Bayesian manner, right? As it happens, people don't deal with evidence in a Bayesian manner particularly well. But the idea behind the predictive processing framework is that your brain deals with information in this manner, even at the earliest stages of visual processing. So what's the take-home message from this? Well, it's that a hypothesis could fit the input extremely well, but its prior probability could be so low that it isn't even considered. And you've got the converse as well, right? That a hypothesis could have such a high prior probability that even though it doesn't fit the input very well, it's settled upon. So here's a good example of this, the hollow mask illusion. As the mask turns around and you see the concave back of the mask, you see it as convex. What's going on here? Well, what's happening is that your brain goes, well, hollow face is clearly the hypothesis that fits the input best, but that's got a really low prior probability, right? I don't encounter hollow faces in daily life. However, I do encounter loads of sticky outy faces, right? And so it corrects and selects the sort of normal face hypothesis, and that's where you get that effect. So much for ambiguity. It has to do this, it has to resolve ambiguity as efficiently as possible, right? And efficiency here means something like an optimal trade-off between speed, energy expenditure, and accuracy. And how does the brain select its hypotheses as efficiently as possible? Well, here it helps to think about data compression, an analogy with data compression. So in data compression, you save a lot of bandwidth by only passing in the signal information that is newsworthy, right? You leave out all the stuff that the receiver can fill in for itself. Okay? And that's the information that it already expects or predicts. So what's newsworthy inside the brain? Well, what the relevant part of the brain, the receiver of the signal, right, which can be sensory, if you're talking at that level, but it also functions all the way up the hierarchy. Okay? Whatever the relevant part of the brain hasn't already predicted. So that's prediction error. So in Howie 2013, he states this dictum. He says, all the brain ever does is minimize prediction error. So putting together these two things, right, the Bayesian strategy and the prediction error minimization implementation of that in the brain, you've got the picture that the brain selects hypotheses based on how well they minimize prediction error. And although this is in constant flux, in principle, the hypothesis selected at a given time constitutes the subject's current worldview, what they take to be the case. So there are some further developments to predictive processing, and I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. So, you know what I said about the ambiguity, the Bayesian ambiguity resolution? Well, that's actually hierarchically arranged. Right? This is schematic. Within each of these hierarchical layers, you've actually got, you know, a potentially infinite number of other, or at least an indeterminate number of hierarchical layers. But basically, the idea is that the brute auditory signal, right, is ambiguous. Right? And so what you do is you disambiguate that to determine the sound heard, right? So it's some kind of squeak, right? And then the sound heard is also ambiguous with regards to whether it, I don't know, is a creaking window or a violin or something like that. And then you disambiguate creaking window, and then you disambiguate burglar or wind. Precision. Now, this is very important, and in particular in psychiatric contexts. So although incoming signals are ambiguous, right, and that's where we get our foot in the door with regards to the Bayesian strategy, in different contexts, the degree of ambiguity differs. Right? So to maximize predictive success over time, the brain needs to accurately estimate how much ambiguity there will be. So in other words, what it needs to make is not just first order predictions, but second order confidence estimations. predictions about how much it should rely on its prediction. This amounts to how much it should pay heed to the prediction error. This amounts to what sometimes gets referred to as modulating the gain on prediction error. So the amount of prediction error that you get is partly determined by how well your predictions fit the input, but also their precision, how much gain you put on the prediction error signal that you're getting. Now, interestingly, it's hypothesized that this gain modulation is that dopamine has a role to play in this modulation gain. So here, this is a dark alleyway. Now, this is a context of low informational quality rather than high informational quality, and therefore you should turn down the gain on the bottom-up sensory prediction error. But what that means is that you rely more on the top-down. Right? So that means that as you're walking down here, you might suddenly jump because to your left looks like there's a lurking person, right? And for a split second, it might look for all the world like you can make out their face and all that, and you go, oh, actually, that's just a bin or whatever, right? Okay. But the idea that in different contexts, because there are different levels, different amounts of informational quality, different amounts of ambiguity, right, you need to set the precision differently. So that gives you another layer at which a mistake can happen, right? You can make a mistake because your hypotheses are wrong, or you can make a mistake because you haven't set the precision accurately. Okay. So far we've said nothing about action and motoric activity. Right? We've been talking about perception. So how does this work within predictive processing? Another way of putting this is, where do motor commands fit in all of this? Well, there's this nice paper by Adam, Shipp, and Friston. They put this in terms of predictions, not commands. So there are two ways of minimizing prediction error. You can update the model to better fit the world. That's what they call perceptual inference. But you can also update the world to better fit the model. That's active inference. But the relevant part of the world, right, is your body. Right? So the idea is that me raising my hand, right, involves me generating a proprioceptive prediction that then gets fulfilled by my arm going up. Okay. Emotion and affect. So now we've talked about perception and action. What about emotion? Now this is interesting because unlike with action, where basically there's broad agreement as to how this works, there are various successive waves of thinking about emotion within the predictive processing framework. So you've got Anil Seth in 2013, who takes emotional experience to be the interoceptive analog of exteroceptive perceptual experience. Right? So your emotional experience, on his account, corresponds to the hypothesis that your nervous system adopts in order to explain away interoceptive prediction error. You get this very Jamesian approach where emotion is basically experience of bodily change. So the idea is it's like inwardly turned perception. But people have thought that this doesn't quite work. It puts emotion on the perceptual inference side of things, but it seems like it should be at least partly on the active inference side of things. And it doesn't account for effective valence. So once you say that once you've selected a hypothesis to explain away your interoceptive signals, that doesn't carry any positivity or negativity with it. Right? Whereas some theorists have felt that actually emotions kind of have an intrinsic relationship to valence, to positivity and negativity. So that's where a couple of further waves of thinking have come in. So Gioffoli and Coricelli say that instead of tying valence to the achievement of some particular error minimized state, a dynamic alternative in which valence is taken to be the rate at which this error is being reduced. So in a sense, they sort of go to the first order derivative of prediction error minimization. And van der Kruis extends this story by suggesting that rather than being straightforwardly a matter of a positive upwards rate of error reduction, pleasure occurs when our actual rate of error reduction is higher than predicted. Now, this is the final modification. So recent theorists have moved away from talking about predictive processing to talking about free energy. I'm sure some of you have heard of the free energy principle, but the idea is that predictive processing is just an implementation of a broader principle, which is the free energy principle. Anything that retains its integrity obeys the free energy principle. And hierarchical predictive processing is simply how organisms with nervous systems manage to do that at rapid timescales. So the free energy principle encourages an embodied and representation-light approach to predictive processing, which is why some people have found that quite appealing. So you move from the idea that organisms, or even brains, right, use models of their environment, to the idea that organisms are models of their environment. Right? That's the kind of shift you get from PP to FEP. So the idea is that the fact that your hand looks like that, right, is not a prediction error minimization, a free energy minimization strategy, right? But just over eons of evolution, right? But when you've got neurons on the scene, free energy could be minimized very rapidly, right? And that's sort of quite intuitive, right? The idea that you've got flexibility and adaptivity at a phenotypic level, right? Literally in the morphology of the organism, right? But you've also got rapid goal-directed adaptivity with the arrival of neurons. So that's my sort of primer on predictive processing. Now, what's the deal with predictive processing in psychiatry? So predictive processing gives us an account of how the brain works, in principle, and in the service of what, right? Why it's doing what it's doing. So far, I've said nothing about psychiatric phenomena. But psychiatric phenomena and other divergent phenomena can be explained in terms of different things going wrong or differently in this process. So the idea is that once you've got predictive processing, right, you've got all of these different knobs that you can twiddle and see, hypothesize about what happens when you make alterations to the overall picture. So it's being used to make sense of delusions, hallucinations, depression, PTSD, addiction, anxiety, depersonalization, autism, Parkinson's, probably more things, right, by now. I'm a bit out of the loop, and it's such a fast-moving thing. But there seems to be a small industry of people going, well, predictive processing hasn't yet been applied to this, right? And then they apply it to that. So the question is, are all of these people just people with hammers who see everything as a nail? Right? That's the danger. Okay. And I think that the answer to that is no, not quite. That's not quite what's going on, but we need to be really careful. Okay. So now moving on to a short second part. Right? So what is so great about computational psychiatry? And by that, I mean, what's so great about predictive processing as applied to psychiatric phenomena? So here are some virtues of predictive processing. You've got a convergent
I think we've lost sound from the room. guys, in the room, you're muted. If you could unmute, thank you.
Is that better?
That's better.
Brilliant, perfect, thank you.
Great, thanks for spotting that. Great, yeah, so it updates explanatory concerns, it provides testable predictions, it makes suggestions for treatment. So some of these will crop up later, but I'm sort of front-loading. I'm sort of front-loading here. So just to unpack these, so you've got a convergence of work in AI, robotics, neurobiology, computational modeling, computational linguistics, right? They all sort of converge in terms of the results that they end up with. Andy Clark's BBS paper in 2013, it gives a really good sense of how it is that people working in different disciplines have sort of converged. You get a convergence of perspectives. So I think one area where this is particularly striking is you almost bridge what has typically been seen to be a conceptually impossible gap to bridge, right, between phenomenology and neuroscience. Right? But once you understand computationally what's going on in terms of attention and salience, right, then you can sort of match up, right, well, I can understand what it would be like to find things hypersalient. It helps us to solve some pretty major puzzles, right? So how is this sort of magic molecule, dopamine, somehow centrally involved in psychosis, addiction, and Parkinson's, right? Well, predictive processing says, well, all of this stuff at that level of description seems really heterogeneous. But if you go down to the common currency of precision, right, then it kind of makes sense. It updates our explanatory concerns. So, like I briefly mentioned, with hallucination, right, you no longer ask, where does the illusion of a worldly stimulus come from? Right? The role of the world is much, much less great. So instead, you ask yourself, why is the hypothesis selected? Why is the hallucinatory hypothesis selected? Provides various testable predictions with eye tracking, statistical learning, fMRI, TMS. Okay, and it makes suggestions for treatment. So in particular, at the pharmacological level, right, in terms of dopamine metabolization, but also at the level of learning, right, at the level of non-pharmacological approaches. So much for the virtues of predictive processing. What are the vices of predictive processing? And I think there's one overarching vice, and it's this, right? That it explains everything. So I'm a fan of predictive processing. But anyone who thinks that this is true, right, is not so much overestimating the power of predictive processing, but misunderstanding what explanation is. Right? So in a sense, I'm sort of scratching an itch that I've had for a while, right? Which is that people talk about the predictive processing as being able to explain everything. And I don't think that what they're doing is overestimating the power of predictive processing. I want to leave that as it is. It's super duper powerful, right? But we need to think a bit more about what explanation is. Okay. So a pragmatic view of explanation and explanatory power. So this is what I mean when I say this is a pragmatist perspective. Namely, a pragmatist in philosophy of science. So very, very broadly speaking, in the vast area of philosophy of science that is philosophy of explanation, you've got three very broad families of views about the nature of explanation. They're logical, ontological, and pragmatic. And my favorite view, surprise, surprise, is the pragmatic view. So one way of thinking about these families of views, right, is if you have the schema X explains Y, right? What kinds of things are the values of X and Y, right? What kinds of things plug into X and Y? And depending on our answers to this, we get the 3 different families of views of explanation. And then you've got refinements within each family that yield more fine-grained differences. So logical view of explanation says the logically related propositions are the values of X and Y. So an explanandum, the thing to be explained, is a proposition that follows deductively from the thing that does the explaining. So Hempel's version of this is a covering law model, right? So premise 1, this apple is a thing with mass. The law, things with mass fall to the ground when dropped. And the conclusion, therefore, this apple will fall to the ground when dropped. The consequences of the logical view. Scientific and ordinary explanations, everyday explanations that we give to one another, why did you raise your hand? I wanted to ask a question, are profoundly different in nature. Explanations are objectively out there to be discovered, and explanations are grounded in merely explanations that are grounded in merely statistical regularities are second class, right? So it's no secret that Hempel kind of had this very hierarchical view of the sciences, right? And right at the top was physics. Right? Physics is the emperor of science. Okay. An ontological view of explanation says you've got concrete events as the values of X and Y. Okay, so one event explains another event, right? And in particular, causes explain their effects. Okay. So the presence of fire explains the presence of smoke. Again, consequences for an ontological view. Scientific and ordinary explanations are different in nature. Again, explanations are out there to be unearthed. You find a particular event, you unearth the explanation of that event, namely its cause or causes. Perhaps counterintuitively, this means that explanations exist in a world devoid of inquiring agents. Imagine a possible world where there are no inquiring agents. There just are relations of cause and effect that are explanatory, even if nobody is there to care about that. A pragmatic view of explanation is very different. So, according to a pragmatic view of explanation, communicative acts are the values of X and Y. So an explanation is a good answer to an explanation-seeking question, what I'm calling an E question. Communicative acts are heavily dependent on a number of contextual factors. These include, among other things, the informational state and conceptual limitations and explanatory concerns of the consumer of the explanation, right? The recipient of that explanatory communicative act. Okay? So the consumer is not necessarily an individual, it can be a group, it can be the scientific community or the general public, right? It can also be oneself. So you can ask a question of yourself and then answer it. So consequences of a pragmatic view, in stark contrast to the other two views, scientific and ordinary explanations are essentially the same. The former simply has a more regimented context. Right? So the idea is that there are just various contextual constraints on scientific discourse that don't exist in everyday discourse. Explanations are demanded within a wider pragmatic context, whether it be everyday life, the court of law, the lab, the clinic, etc. Explanations, being the product of communicative acts, aren't unearthed, but they're carefully expressed. They are answerable to how things stand in the world, but they need to be selective and comprehensible to the consumer. Explanations simply do not exist in a possible world devoid of inquiring beings that demand and give explanations. Explanations are demanded within a wider pragmatic context. Oh, sorry, I don't know why that has to be. I didn't. 2 and 5, as you can see, are identical. I don't know how that happened. Anyway. So here's a brief interlude. If we think about human beings as predictive processes, then with pragmatic accounts, pragmatic accounts relativize explanation to the individual that is producing and consuming explanations. Right? So it matters what kind of cognitive being the people giving and receiving explanations are. Right? So if you take predictive processing seriously, right, then what is explanation becomes what is explanation for agents with hierarchically predictive brains. Right? So for example, unlike physics, neuroscience investigates the investigator. Now this is relevant for philosophy of science. So what I've been doing is I've been applying philosophy of science to predictive processing, but there's a sense in which here you get a bit of flow in the opposite direction, right? That if you think of the scientist as having a hierarchical predictive brain, right, then there's this anxiety in philosophy of science concerning the reality or otherwise of these theoretical and unobserved entities. But if the predictive processing framework is right, then all of cognition is about postulating hidden causes for the purposes of predictive success. Right? So squeamishness about talking about reasons rather than neurons, for example, right, should technically be shelved, right, if you buy into predictive processing, right, because that's what predictive processing says cognition is all about. Right? So there's this sort of interesting little irony, right, that coupled with a pragmatic theory of explanation, our best theory of the brain tells us that we shouldn't be reductionists. But anyway, that was just an interlude. So there's a kind of pragmatism that I endorse called interrogative pragmatism, and it has a particular emphasis on questions and on the meanings of questions as derived pragmatically. So compare these questions. Right? Why do birds fly south? Why do birds fly south? Why do birds fly south? Right? Although these are exactly the same string of words, right? These are different questions. Okay, the emphasis signals a different explanatory concern. Okay? And this is a kind of surface feature of something that everyone agrees in the philosophy of explanation, which is that explanations are contrastive. You don't just explain X, you explain why you get X instead of Y, right? Where Y is relevantly related to X. Okay? So why do birds, as opposed to other animals, fly south? Why do birds fly as opposed to walk or swim south? Why do birds fly south as opposed to north or east or west? Right? That's clearly what the emphasis is getting at. This is sometimes called a contrastive articulation, right? And explanation just doesn't work without contrastive articulation. So one upshot of this, right, is that some of my favorite books have titles that are, strictly speaking, misleading, right? Consciousness Explained. No, you can't say X Explained. Right? You explain why you get something as opposed to something else. Madness Explained. Explaining culture. I get what they're getting at, right? But strictly speaking, these are misleading, right? Because you don't explain X. You explain why you get X as opposed to Y. So it makes no sense to speak of the explanation of a phenomenon. The best you can hope for is a good answer to a good question that pertains to a phenomenon. We need to make sure that we're asking the right questions and that we then answer those very questions and not other questions. There's no reductive hierarchy of scientificness. Social psychology is neither more nor less scientific than single neuron electrophysiology. It has its own questions and its own ways of answering them. So answers to questions of one discipline can stimulate questions in another. But what you want to avoid is directly answering, for example, a psychological question with a neuroscientific answer. Right? You can, however, indirectly answer them in ways that we might touch upon later. So you get different levels and kinds of question, and with that, different levels and kinds of explanation. So there's a different fineness of grain at which we have explanatory concerns, and hence at which we direct our questioning. That's levels of explanation. But you've also got different kinds of questions that you can ask that are all explanation demanding. So how come, right? Asking for causes. How come there's a hole in the ozone layer? How? Asking for mechanism. How did there come to be a hole in the ozone layer? Right. Unfortunately, both can be expressed with a causal use of why. And then why, which is asking for reasons. Why did you do that? Why do you believe that? So explanations vary across two dimensions, a relatively well-established one of levels of explanation, but you also have kinds of explanation. And this isn't a matter of ontological dispute. It's not like somebody who thinks there are different kinds of explanation is saying something particularly weird about the nature of reality. It's just about the way in which we request and receive explanation. Okay, so much for what explanation is. What about explanatory power? So explanatory power is whatever makes an explanation good independently of factual accuracy. So in order to ascertain the explanatory power of an explanation or a theory, you ask yourself, how good would this explanation be if it were true? Right, bracketing the question of whether it's true. So to get a handle on explanatory power, it's crucial to differentiate explanatory virtues, right, that are to do with the structure of the explanation, from evidential virtues that are to do with how likely it is to be true. Right? Often we overemphasize evidential virtues at the expense of explanatory virtues. So what sorts of things have explanatory power? Explanations do, but theories and frameworks do as well. And explanatory power is usually crops up in the context of a competitive contrast. So you bracket the question of factual accuracy and you ask yourself, which of two competing explanations or frameworks has more explanatory power? So you'll notice that I refer to the predictive processing as a predictive processing framework. But you might think, well, predictive processing kind of looks more like a theory than a framework, right? Isn't it a theory or is it a frame? Which is it? Is it a theory or a framework? And the kind of standard way of thinking about this in philosophy of science is that it depends on whether you think of it, whether you're an instrumentalist, effectively, and you think of it as one very useful way of thinking about things, but there are plenty of other ways of thinking about the same stuff, or if you're more committed to the robust reality and potentially exclusivity of predictive processing. But generally speaking, frameworks compete with each other for usefulness, right? How useful is a framework, whereas theories compete with each other for truth and accuracy. Okay. But not much hangs on this here. So what is this process of generating explanations? So explanation demanding questions, questions, and the answers to them are very closely related. In fact, they kind of mutually determine and constrain each other. With the birds flying south and stuff like that, one of the ways in which you get purchase on what the question means is what a good answer to that question would be, right? So they're sort of internally related. Okay. But what this means, right, is that generating explanations is not therefore primarily about answering questions, it's about asking the right questions. So if you think about the explanatory power of frameworks, and this is with a view to talking about predictive processing, there's a quantitative dimension and a qualitative dimension. So quantitatively, is it explanatorily powerful? Does it generate lots of explanations? No, that's not what we're after. right? That's too trivial. Generates lots of kinds of explanations, that's more like it, right? And qualitatively, does it generate good explanations? Okay. So this thing here on the quantitative side, call that explanatory virtue scope. So let's bank that. Scope is one of the explanatory virtues that we're interested in. But what about generating good explanation? Here you've got two other virtues. So that gives us the three virtues that we're interested in: scope, precision, and integration. So other things being equal, precise explanations are better than imprecise explanations. And other things being equal, explanations that fit in with other explanations, background knowledge, and a theoretical framework are better than ones that just sort of come out of nowhere, right? And that you can't embed in other knowledge. So what's precision? So a nice way of thinking about precision that comes from Ilikowski and Kurikowski, clearly mispronounced that, never mind, is that precision is modal proximity. So what do I mean by modal proximity? I mean closeness in the space of possible worlds, right? In the space of possibility. So an explanation, which on this account is a kind of answer, has more precision. The closer in the space of possibilities, the possibilities ruled out are to the actual world. Okay? So suppose somebody has bought a navy blue car. The question, why did this person choose blue as opposed to any other color? With why did this person choose navy blue as opposed to any other shade of blue? Right? This is a more precise question, right? Because blue and navy blue are closer to each other than just blue and yellow. So if you think about a psychiatric example, why does this individual hear a voice? An answer that explains why an individual hears a voice at all as opposed to not hearing a voice has some explanatory power, right? It has better explanatory power than why somebody is hearing an auditory experience rather than no auditory experience, right? Because at least it gives you the quality of voice. But it has less explanatory power, all other things being equal, than one that explains not only why the person hears a voice, but the precise voice that they do, right? As opposed to another voice, right? So why does this person hear the voice of an abusive stepfather? Okay, so that explanation is more precise. Integration is fairly intuitive, that an integrated body of knowledge is better than the sum of its parts. And that's because explanations that are well integrated into a framework, they stimulate new and unforeseen e-questions, and they can also feed back into the framework and flesh it out further. And I think that we can see all of this quite unselfconsciously in computational psychiatry. So just coming into the final straight on the optimal use of computational psychiatry. So we picked out scope, precision, and integration. Does predictive processing exemplify these three virtues? I think the answer is yes. So the far-reaching scope of predictive processing. Predictive processing generates lots of different kinds of explanation. Psychosis is a good example. Right? So predictive processing can explain why childhood trauma might influence your priors, right? So that would be a kind of an experience-based approach, a learning-based approach, right? But it can also explain why neurotransmitter dysregulation might generate erroneous levels of precision in prediction error. It also has the capacity for precision, right? The capacity for precision. I'm not saying that it often is precise, but the extent to which we demand precise explanations depends on our explanatory concerns. So when explaining something like binocular rivalry or the hollow mask illusion, we're being very precise indeed, right? The relevant contrasts, right? A face-house mashup, right? Or a hollow face are modally very close indeed, right? The idea that there's a very nearby possible world where somebody might instead of having bistable switching, would have a face-house mashup, right? Or instead of experiencing the hollow mask illusion, wouldn't experience the hollow mask illusion and would just see a hollow mask. But also, if you look at PTSD, you can say, well, it's that experience and not any other because there was that particular traumatic experience. So there isn't always precision, but there's the capacity for precision. Like I've mentioned already, it seems like predictive processing achieves integration. You've got neurobiology, psychophysics, computational modeling, and so on. So the key lessons. You don't just explain X, you explain why you get X and not Y, right? Where X and Y are relevant contrasts, but what determines relevance, right, is clearly your explanatory concerns, right? So there's not just a universal level of relevance, it's relevant relative to our explanatory concern. Explaining something is not simply describing in more basic terms what is happening when that thing is happening, right? Although that can inform explanation. I think a lot of work in predictive processing is slightly guilty of this fallacy, right? Of saying, well, what's really going on is prediction error minimization. But saying what's really going on doesn't explain anything any more than you try to explain, the stock market, the global economic downturn in 2008 by talking about vibrating atoms, right? Yeah, all that's really going on in the universe, right, is vibrating atoms. Right? It needs to cater to explanatory concerns. Okay. But there aren't just norms in terms of catering to explanatory concerns. There are norms to do with having the right explanatory concerns. So what you've got with predictive processing is you've got a lot of power, but a lot of constraint as well. So predictive processing doesn't in itself explain everything. It forms a framework for thinking about what the brain is doing, against which we can approach lots of perplexing and important phenomena and carefully formulate good questions and generate good answers. So what does the future hold? I think at the moment there's an awful lot of talking about predictive processing, right? Whereas on the picture that I'm painting, right, those of us who promote predictive processing will have won when predictive processing is simply lurking invisibly in the background. And nobody's talking about predictive processing, everyone's assuming it. Right? That would be the victory for it. And it does mean that you get all of these papers that are applying predictive processing to as yet unapplied things that haven't yet had it applied to, where you keep coming across these sorts of introductions to predictive processing at the start of all of these papers. The idea would be that it should be just lurking in the background. But the thing is also, even if predictive processing is correct about what the nervous system is fundamentally up to, right, there are very, very many perfectly good E-questions for which the predictive processing framework has no relevance whatsoever, right? Except insofar as it can't contradict it, right? The same way as our economic theories can't contradict Newtonian physics, right? It's highly unlikely that they would, right? But if it's correct, it can't be contradicted, but it might just not be relevant. Okay. So just to end, in many cases, our explanatory concerns, and this is sort of building off the last point I made, are not about an agent's brain, right, but about an agent's environment and their life, right, and how they are embedded in the world. But this is totally consistent with predictive processing, right? Because ultimately, all the brain is doing is plugging into the deep statistical structure of the world. Right? And so there's this nice irony that if this turns out to be our best theory of what the brain is doing, the brain is kind of saying, don't look at me, look out there, right? Because all I'm doing is plugging into the structure of what's out there. Okay, thank you.
Great, well, thanks, Sam. We've got time now for questions. So what we'll do, because we're sort of in the mix here in the room and online, if you can, if you want to ask a question online, if you can just raise your hand or put a question in the chat function, and then we'll identify you, and then you can unmute your mic. Otherwise, I think we're just going to get a little bit complicated. So let's begin. Any questions? Anyone want to start off? Is it? I can't see the full name.
Oh, is that Phil Corlett?
Phil Corlett. Yeah, Phil Corlett. Do you want to ask a question?
Sure thing. Thanks, Sam, for a great talk. Very stimulating as always. I picked up on a bit of a problem, or maybe it isn't a problem to you, but I think in your classification of explanations piece, when you said that neural data can't have anything to say about psychology, I think quite a few cognitive neuroscientists would sort of have a bit of a problem about that.
Yeah.
And that would be quite ironic given the people who work with the framework and the work that they do. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't mean to suggest that at all. So where is... Oh, am I still sharing? Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yikes. There's a lot. So basically, I'm not going to find the slide. Where what I said was that it couldn't directly answer the questions, but it could indirectly inform answers to that question, right? So the idea might be that and in a sense, that's ideally what you would want to do, right? So the idea would be that you would want to use data from neuroscience to kind of give you the sort of to kind of either constrain or inform or give you the building blocks of the psychological phenomena, and it might even revise our understanding of the psychological phenomena, right? But then ultimately, if the psychological question has been well posed, then it should be answered at the psychological level. Of course, one thing that the neuro stuff can do is it can do two things. It can come in and it can say, right, let's plug into an answer, a psychological answer to that psychological question, right? Or it can say, that's an ill-posed question and it shouldn't have been asked in the first place. Here's a better question, right? So like a good example of that is like in delusions literature, right? When people ask, why does a delusional patient believe something? And what they mean by that is, on what evidential grounds do they believe what they do? And you start to have people say things like, their experience tells them this, and that's like the first factor, and then they have like a second factor, reasoning deficit and stuff like that. It seems like what neuroscience can do is can come in and say, well, look, I appreciate that as kind of like folk psychological beings who trade in these kinds of explanations, right? It's hugely tempting to think that that answer is going to be available, but maybe we could just give an answer at the level of, well, their brain is doing some stuff that means that they just believe this, right? And you don't need to think internally. So that would be a way in which, like, it could say that question is ill-posed. Another way, the other kind of thing where it could feed in, and instead of saying that the question is ill-posed, could like inform the question, is say something like, well, actually, perception and belief are on a continuum, and so this kind of weird sort of testimonial view of perception where, like, my perceptual experience tells me something and then I sort of decide whether to believe it or not. It's sort of misleading, and in fact, lots of experiences like carry doxastic weight, right? And that could be something that you know, neuroscience could push towards. Does that help at all?
No, absolutely. And you know, I had in mind the two-factor theory, you know, as you brought it up, and of course, to me, that's the sort of fallacy of cognitive neuropsychology, right? There's a neuro in it, even though they deny that neuro stuff can impact their explanations. It really does, right? It just depends on the neuro stuff being damaged and not working very well. So there's another kind of deep irony there too.
100%.
Yeah. But thank you. That really helps.
Thanks so much. Fantastic question. Great opportunity for me to clarify that. I need to make sure that I make that abundantly clear in the future. Thanks.
Well, Emily, you've probably got a better sense of the queue than I have, but I can see Chloe has got a hand up. Chloe, do you want to unmute?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Chloe.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I found it very clear and stimulating. Lots of usefully expressed things. So thank you. I was listening a bit to Quentin's question as well, and I was wondering whether we should consider this more as a sort of Kuhnian paradigm of through which hopefully, or perhaps lots of areas of scientific and philosophical understanding are moving into possibly in however many decades that lasts for. But it struck me as maybe this is more of a paradigm than a theory. And I suppose maybe that's another word for a framework. But it would be interesting to hear your reflections on that. But I guess the other thing that came to mind and would be interesting as someone who sometimes is interested in educating medical students, for example, is that there seems to be a deficit of explicit models of what it is to be a human being in the world that are, say, for example, taught in medical school. And I was wondering whether if you say had a group of medical students to teach, would you, for example, present this as a model of being human, possibly combined with an active embodied sort of model, alongside other models, or how would you think about teaching this so that it then might become this assumption in the background of different areas of practice and society that you suggest that you would like to see? So sorry, that was a bit of a two-part question. But...
Yeah, well, so can I mush those parts together, right? Because I sort of think that one can and maybe should, right? So your point about the paradigm is very closely related to what I said towards the end when I said, well, kind of victory for us predictive processing proponents would be when it falls in the background, right? When it becomes assumed and it's something that you transparently work through and with, rather than being what is actually part of what we talk about. And I think that's sort of the final stage of the Kuhnian process, right? When the paradigm becomes fully accepted after the transitional phase, it becomes invisible, right? It becomes just part of how things are done. And so there's that aspect, but it seems to me that the invisibility of the predictive processing framework also comes from what I think is its sort of is kind of inbuilt externalism, right? So the idea that if the brain is a super nifty engine for sort of plugging you into your environment, right? Plugging you into a volatile environment so that the best example of this as a phenomenon in the world is language, right? Language is hierarchically, statistically arranged in a way that makes a human brain really, really good at learning it, right? And so I guess all of this is by way of saying that when you ask about being human, I'm not sure that I would necessarily talk about predictive processing per se, because what I would ideally want to do is kind of assume predictive processing, but then once I assume predictive processing, then where all the action is isn't in the brain, right? The brain is just going to do its thing, right? And where all the action is sociology, literature, you know, it's going to be all of this stuff out there. Does that kind of answer your question?
Can I follow up just from the last two, just bring a question to you from within the room? So, I mean, I understood Quintin's question is about you know, under what conditions could predictive processing be just compared? Be really a question about, is it falsifiable? And you know, maybe not. But with this whole tradition of thinking, which you know isn't so new, is it? I mean, it goes back to Helmholtz. You know, Werner Hill was trying to do. It's always attracted concerns about that, hasn't it? At this point, you know, Jaspers called it neuromythology. That was his phrase, meaning it becomes a framework in the background which becomes too all-embracing, too encompassing. The concern you expressed about explaining everything. So, I mean, surely that would be a big hesitation to teaching. You don't want to teach medical students stuff that tries to explain everything. You want to give them specific examples which they can use in practice to bring about use. This is your emphasis on pragmatism.
Exactly.
So then let's think of an example of that. So the ones that we tend to use in psychiatry, which may now be considered a little bit old-fashioned in this field, is the Chris-Frith model of auditory verbal hallucinations and the notion of self-monitoring. But that's not phrased mathematically; it's phrased in neuropsychological terms in boxes and arrows, basically, isn't it? But it's quite nice, and it gives a sort of mechanism for being able to explain or understand phenomena which is otherwise rather hard to get your head around, basically. So that's an example. But what does it really explain in terms of the sort of pragmatic criteria that you're using? I think from a clinical perspective, it's not clear actually what it explains. So therefore, what does it do? Does it actually help us understand it better? Does it help us sort of feel our way into it? That, you know, your reference to phenomenology as part of the enterprise here. Well, maybe it does, but I just wondered where you are on that. So what's a concrete example of this tradition bringing about pragmatic explanation in psychiatry, useful explanation? What does it allow a clinician to forecast? What does it allow a clinician to intervene on?
So the Frithian account, I think, does tell you something, right? If it's explanatorily powerful, bracketing the issue of whether it's accurate, in the sense that what it tells you is that the experienced stimulus is something that is self-produced, that is not being recognized as being self-produced. So what you have is you've got a kind of self-produced like raw materials of the hallucination, often thought to be inner speech or something like that. So it seems to me like the Frithian view says something quite specific about what an AVH is, and it also kind of might lead you to suggest that there's like a general capacity that's been interfered with, that is just that operates on inner speech in the case of ADH, but it could operate on loads of other stuff as well. So that might give you some clues about how, well, how do we get this person's self-monitoring back on track? But there's a sense in which that model has sort of quite visible moving parts, whereas one thing that can be a little bit concerning about predictive processing is that it's all so fine-grained that it doesn't have these sort of big clunking moving parts, right? So I'm sort of clutching at straws here. Am I going anywhere with this?
So it's actually,
am I catering to your explanatory concerns?
Well, but it seems to me that, okay, so you've got the Frith model, which we can kind of understand. It's got these clunky moving parts, as you described it. But the direction of travel here with computational psychiatry is a movement away from that. That's too clunky.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But I mean, that to a clinician sounds like a movement away
from what I can intervene on.
Yeah.
I see exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
So
but I don't want to dominate.
No. But I think that's a very good point. So I think there are ways in which, like, the Frithian model has been integrated into predictive processing, and people say, well, what happens is that everything is prediction, and sometimes in the service of predictions, I will have these self-monitoring mechanisms. But yeah, as you're saying, what that is effectively doing is it's breaking up all of the moving parts and looking at finding a kind of common currency in everything. And the trouble is that I mean, here what you have is a sort of trade-off where as a psychiatrist, you want to find the right coarseness of grain so that you get purchase on what to intervene on. And if you've got somebody with predictive processing coming in and breaking up all of these moving parts and saying, oh, well, actually, it's all just prediction error minimization, then you kind of lose, that might be true, but then you lose your purchase, right? So I guess I think that this is coming close to sort of one of the take-home messages, which is that in a lot of cases, you would want, even if predictive processing is right, let's assume that it is right, then given certain explanatory concerns that you might have, at most all it does is constrain things. At most all it does is force you into saying things that don't directly contradict it. But ultimately what you're going to be doing is presenting something with big clunky moving parts that can be nicely intervened upon, I think. Does that?
Yeah.
Well, can I very quickly chip in? Because I think I might be able to help you out there, Sam, because I've just read your 2014 paper on auditory verbal hallucinations.
Oh, right.
So just very quickly. So basically what I think the advantage of a predictive process, actually comparative models and predictive process are actually very similar. But the advantage, I think, of the predictive processing framework clinically is it gives you the language of priors. Because it gives you the language of priors and the concept of overweighted priors, which influence the concept of experience. It allows you to relate it to biography. So if you're a psychotherapist and then you have somebody with contentful priors, which reflect previous, trauma or mistreatment or abuse or cultural beliefs, whatever, it allows you to link representation to enculturation, socialization, biography in a way that's clinically relevant. And the notion of overweighting is that whatever other components of the theory are correct or incorrect, that is clinically useful, I think.
Okay, so we'll go to, thanks, Chris. So we'll go to, is it Graham?
We have a couple of comments on the point. So Chloe said it is used in FND and pain treatment, particularly through therapies focused on exposure to avoided activities, tensional modulation, and repetition of corrected embodied experiences. So that's just above. And then Graham's made a comment as well.
Graham, did you want to ask a question, or are you just making a comment in the chat? What would you? Because I think you've had your hand up. You want to unmute? You need to unmute.
Oh, I think he is. Yeah, he is unmuted. He might not have
Okay, there's a problem, I think, with your
I'm
microphone.
going to read it out, Gareth.
with your microphone. Is it a question? Yes.
Yes.
Would the two-brain model be compatible with what you've been saying? These are the emotional immediate survival brain, which thinks magically black and white, egocentrically and concretely, and gets you out of the jaws of a lion. And the logically analytical brain, oops, what's the,
You need to explain it before I can read it out.
can you read it out?
Yeah, sure.
I can't
But
see it.
system 1, system 2, basically, like the Kahneman kind of stuff. Well, so what I think the Kahneman stuff does to predictive processing is that it invites people thinking in terms of predictive processing to reflect on what abstract verbal thinking is within predictive processing, and I think there are two different ways of thinking about that. So one is to think of, you've got the hierarchy, and what you've got is you've kind of got abstract thought operating at larger timescales at the top of the hierarchy. That's one way of thinking. That's not the way I like to think about it. Largely because I think that the stuff at the, if that is right, then the stuff at the top of the hierarchy ought to be Bayes optimal as well, right? And I think that human beings are far from being personal level Bayes optimal, even if their visual systems might be. So the way I like to think about it is that you've got a predictive processing hardware and you have an enculturated software, and the enculturated software is not Bayes optimal. It's very linguistic. It's very open to all sorts of enculturated norms and practices. So the idea is that you get a kind of sui generis a kind of thought that emerges from enculturation that just happens to run on predictive processing hardware, but that doesn't obey predictive processing principles. Now, that I think that answers your question to the extent that all of the predictive processing stuff would be system 1, and then system 2 would be the software running on the predictive processing hardware. But I've never actually thought of that before, so I need to think about it some more. But that's my gut reaction to that. Thank you.
Do you have a couple more questions, perhaps? Yeah, I can't see them.
Had written something, and he had his hand up as well. So I think maybe.
Who's that?
Ahmad.
Ahmad, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, I sort of just threw it in the chat there. I'm not entirely necessarily familiar with the lingo being used. Definitely not fluent in it. But so sort of a comment is a bit more like perhaps more abstract. But I'm sort of, because I feel like a lot is hinging on sort of privileging utility when assessing sort of this framework or theory.
Right.
And I think this privileging utility sort of echoes a market-based criterion of truth that sort of renders it almost truth for the market. Now, I'm not suggesting obviously that that's what you have in mind, but you can think of, I mean, the history of science and, you know, indeed philosophy is full of sort of these theories and frameworks that had a lot of explanatory purchase, but did not actually map, or it turns out did not map on reality.
Yeah.
One can think of, you know, of myth being a good example of that, where myth was for ages used, different myths were for ages used to explain reality, and they were quite successful in doing so as well. So it's not something to undermine. We can undermine them now, but for a long period of time, they did have a lot of explanatory purchase. A more recent example is obviously a lot of us are familiar with is sort of Newtonian physics, and the fact that it sort of also had incredible explanatory power and purchase, but turned out to be, you know, very quote unquote critiquable. That's also sort of a redeeming feature, that you can look at these theories and sort of think of them as sort of very productive mistakes. But nevertheless, I think there is something sort of to be wary about when we look at utility, where almost already forced to sort of hinge on our prior conceptions, because utility itself is sort of embedded in what we think is, at this current conjecture has a utility, basically. And you can think of, the asylum system as having had some utility in the past, right? But that doesn't justify it. So I think this sort of, it's useful to think of utility, and it's useful to sort of extrapolate potentially from utility to accuracy, but I think it can also restrain or deflate any sort of more radical shifts in framework that potentially, whether it's clinical psychiatry or neuroscience, could warrant in their deadlocks. So yeah, it's just sort of a comment. I don't.
You want to take the emphasis off pragmatism? Is that in the account?
I think. Well, I mean, in the history, sort of philosophically, pragmatism does have sort of a double meaning. Functionalism, it also has a double meaning in the sense that you can look at these concepts as gaining their truth value from the fact that they have a function, as in you sort of ground, almost in this very loose terminology, but you can ground ontology on sort of function, but also pragmatism in the more kind of quote unquote economic sense takes a different meaning. That is this useful or not? Useful in what context and to what end, and with what prior conception of utility?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if that made sense.
More of a comment.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I don't think I would disagree with much of that. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Maybe just to clarify, the notion of explanatory power that I was putting forward would say that myth is very explanatorily powerful. But yeah, I mean, I don't think you particularly misconstrue that at all. So no, I think that all makes very good sense. Thank you.
No, yeah, thanks. I mean, I think this also just sort of a very, very short, sorry, I don't want to take up time, but a very short follow-up is this also can be complicated by sort of a very fine distinction between explanatory power and utility. Those perhaps are not interchangeable terms as well. And once you sort of slough them from each other, that kind of also complicates the picture. As in, the question becomes really, what is the point of this framework? Is it to sort of is the point that we subdue phenomena to this framework because it has some clinical utility, or does it actually have explanatory power, as such? But yeah, that's sort of just.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean now. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we're pretty much at time, and good questions and discussions. And thanks, Sam. Yeah. Again, for stimulating us with this.
Thanks so much.
New paradigm.
That was fun. Thank you.